draw me into. It jumps above my pride, truth I cannot hide, to keep you satisfied. True love that now exists is the love I can resist. Jump by my side, drumming and drumming and drumming, drumming and drumming and drumming. Hope you like drumming too. Drumming, drumming, drumming. I wanna drum with you.
Jump down the shelters to get away. The boys are cocking up their guns. Tell us, General, is it party time? If it is, can we all come? Don't think that we don't know. Don't think that we're not trying. Don't think we move too slow. It's no use after crying, saying it's a mistake. It's a mistake. After the laughter has died away, and all the boys have had their fun. No surface noise now, not much to say. They've got the bad guys on the run. Don't try to say you're sorry. Don't say he drew his gun. They've gone and grabbed old Ronnie. He's not the only one saying it's a mistake. It's a mistake. Tell us, Commander, what do you think? 'Cause we know that you love all that power. Is it on then? Are we on the brink? We wish it all, throw in a towel. We'll not fade out too soon. Not in this finest hour. We saw your favorite tune. We'll send a card and flower, saying it's a mistake. It's a mistake. It's a mistake. It's a mistake.
No limit in the sky if I don't wanna fly for ya. No, I'm a tears in my eyes that I wanna cry for ya. With every breath that I take, I want you to share that air with me. There's no promise that I won't keep. I climb a mountain that just know to stay. When it comes to you, there's no crime. Let's take both of our souls and intertwine. When it comes to you, don't be blind. Watch me speak from my heart. When it comes to you, want you to share that. Want you to share that. Keeping it alive, arrow got your name on it. Don't miss hold on alone and regret yourself on it. Open up your mind, clear your head.
Very much for joining us to another keynote panel of our ENANPAD annual meeting. Today's panels, it's about populism and democratic backsliding. This topic talks a lot through our conference themes about tackling global societal challenges and a role for management, for organization, and for society. I would like to welcome our keynote speakers. We have wonderful lineup of keynote speakers today. Professor Dawn Moynihan, it's a McCord Chair at the McCord School of Public Policy, Georgetown University, and previous director at the La Follette School of Public Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Dawn's research seeks to improve how government works. Dawn is a prominent scholar of public administration. His research has been working on behavioral effects to improve of efforts to improve public sector outcome through governance reform. And I also like to mention that Dawn's research has been very influential in policymaking and public institutions within US and outside US. Professor Michele Moraes Desai Silva is a professor at the International and Area Study in the Department of International and Area Studies at Oklahoma University of Oklahoma, and also the co-director of the Center for Brazil Studies. Michele has received her PhD from Columbia University, and she has been working on human rights policy, and particularly today her research is focused on the effects of Bolsonarism on public servants in Brazil. Professor David Arellano-Galt, it's been, this is not the first time that David is joining us at ENANPAD, so you are all welcome again, David. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Professor David is a professor at the Department of Public Administration and CIDA, Mexico City. PhD in Public Administration from the University of Colorado. His research deals with introduction of organizational analysis in diverse public administration and policy issues, and is being working particularly today with the topic of corruption in Latin America. Johan Christensen is joining us from Leiden University at Netherlands. He works at the Institute of Public Administration. His research focuses on the role of experts and expertise in public policy making, both at the national and the European levels. Johan has been working on historical background of populism worldwide. So I do think that we have a very nice lineup of panelists today to discuss such an important topic about populism and the challenges that it imposes, not just for democratic backsliding, but also for public administration and our societies as a whole. So I'd like to start with Dawn. Dawn has been studying Trumpism, the influence of Trumpism of administrative state in the US. So Dawn, please tell us about what are your reflection about the challenges that Trumpism imposes, not just in the US, but probably worldwide. Thanks a lot, Dawn.
Thank you all for being here. This is a topic that I think many of us did not think when we started out, maybe doing research in public administration or whatever field we come from, that we might be focusing on. Certainly, I did not think when I got my PhD in 2002 that I'd be writing about democratic backsliding in America and the threats of populism. But here we are. And I feel some need to perhaps apologize on behalf of the United States for some of the ideas that we have helped to export to other parts of the world. And I think Trump was certainly not the originator of many of these styles of politics, but did show that these were possible in fairly wealthy, developed countries that might have seen these types of politics as an artifact of the past. One value of talking about this collectively across different settings is that it helps us separate out some general phenomena that we see from place to place, as well as the fact that there are always going to be some unique and distinct patterns in any particular country that reflects the history, the structure of power, the party system, as well as traditions like public institutions in a particular setting. With that said, I think the US version of populism and democratic backsliding certainly has a very Trumpist footprint. It does draw upon tendencies in US politics that you can find in the past. Most notably in the 1960s, you see sort of radical elements of the Republican Party engage in some of the same sorts of tactics. So, for example, belief in conspiracies, belief that the state was engaged in some act of undermining the true people. But these voices more or less stayed at the fringes of the party for many, many decades, until Trump, I think, realized that he could build a lane for himself as a popular politician by more directly appealing to those voices in a way that his other Republican counterparts were initially unwilling to do so, but increasingly are following his lead in this domain. Across the decades, but again, really in the last 6 or 7 years, you see certain types of tendencies. One is the language of delegitimization, so undermining the claims that public institutions are legitimate sources of power in society. A second is deconstructing those institutions. And the third is to assert control over those institutions. And I think the US certainly has a deep suspicion of public institutions generally and centralization of authority. That's part of the underlying logic for why the US Constitution was written and why the US broke away from the United Kingdom. But that suspicion has curdled into something much darker in the last few years, into a sort of repeated claim that public officials, including bureaucrats, are deep state enemies of the people, are part of some sort of swamp that needs to be drained. And this practice of delegitimization undermines the capacity and the belief in the capacity that government can deliver on democratic promises. And over the course of Trump's time in power, you see the way in which this language has evolved. Initially, it was quite sort of vague about the swamp and the deep state. And over time, it's become increasingly pointed, focusing on the actual or perceived enemies of Trumpism. And that started in particular with parts of the government that were tasked with holding Trump accountable or investigating his practices. So it included parts of the intelligence services, the Federal Bureau of Investigations, now the National Archives, because they sought to get some records back. So they're also sort of a corrupt institution now. It extends also beyond the federal government. This idea of public officials as being a threat, we've also seen that language extend to public health officials during the pandemic, election administration officials who were accused of rigging an election because President Trump did not win, as well as increasingly schools where teachers in public schools are subject to very critical accounts, usually for either talking about a history of race and power in America or for acknowledging people's different gender identities in the classroom, generating a strong backlash and some fairly populist sentiment. This sort of language contributes to the second pattern, which I think is the deconstruction, which involves these political actors, to the extent they can, finding ways to undermine administrative capacities. And they do so in a variety of ways, but one good example is recently there was debate about tax revenue in the United States and how much power the IRS should have. And historically, the IRS has basically, over the last 20 years, had fewer and fewer employees, even though it's been asked to do more and more. We see increasing tax evasion become a pattern, including probably with President Trump, if you believe news reporting. And this is sort of a fairly obvious outcome of a disinvestment in administrative capacity. So we have less tax revenue because we've stopped giving the IRS the capacity to do its job. And so what we see instead is this debate about whether we should really have a reasonably well-run tax reporting system. And you even see this debate about tax revenue and the IRS become part of the discussion of, for example, the raid on President Trump's home in Mar-a-Lago by FBI, where Republicans are saying, if you can see the FBI doing this to President Trump, just imagine what thousands of new IRS agents will do to you at some point in the future. And so these debates about delegitimization also inform actual policy decisions about, for example, how much of a budget we should give to the agency that's performing, one of the most core tasks of the state, which is to collect revenue in order to actually deliver public services. The third tendency is political control. And here, the sort of populist backsliding element of what we're seeing says, if you can't deconstruct the administrative state, you take control of it. And this has happened in a variety of ways. One very clear example, you see many actors who are suspicious of or say that the 2020 election was rigged, seeking to take control of election administration positions so that in the future they can determine the outcome of the election more to their liking and perhaps inconsistent with the actual results of the election. You see it with school board elections, where you have more extremist candidates run for these elected official positions at the very local level, and then using that as a way to impose their politics in the classroom, in the process, deprofessionalizing the role of teachers. And you also see it at the federal level, where at the end of his first administration, President Trump attempted to put in place an executive order which would have vastly expanded the number of political appointees in government. The US has something like 4,000 political appointees. They can be fired by the president without cause. And President Trump's Schedule F executive order would have allowed him to reclassify any civil servant that had a policy advisory or a policy-making role to become a political appointee, thereby allowing him to fire that individual. Ultimately, this executive order was reversed by the Biden administration, but it's quite likely that it would come back with either a second Trump administration or, to be honest, pretty much any other potential Republican candidate in 2024. That would be an extraordinary change, certainly the biggest change in the history of the US civil service system, which was created in the 1880s, in that it could allow much more direct political control by a group of actors who have repeatedly expressed a lack of faith in the civil service system and are suspicious of expertise and science in various domains where it disagrees with their preferences. The final point I'll add is control can come via formal processes, but it can also come via informal processes. Some of the language that delegitimizes public officials also creates a risk of political violence and intimidation, where, for example, public health officials are worried about going into certain communities. Election officials may need to have personal protection because their home information has been posted online, or school superintendents find that there are protests out in front of their homes. These are not very visible public officials. They might be low-level office holders, but they become subject to the potential for a form of political control where there's at least the implicit threat of violence in a way that is quite different from what we would have expected, say 10 years ago. I'll stop there. I really look forward to your questions and to the comments of the other panelists.
Thank you very much, Don. It's the striking similarities of Trump's strategies to approach bureaucracy, Bolsonaro's strategies are impressive. Even if we consider, the attempt to reform the bureaucracy, very similar to Schedule F that you referred to, the forms of formal and informal control, the delegitimization of the public servants and public sector, generally speaking, etc. But I think David would like to ask David to jump in, because probably particularly here in Brazil, people are asking if a left-wing, at least rhetorically left-wing populist is different in terms of strategy or forms of approaching bureaucracy. So what is different? What is unique in AMLO's approach to bureaucracy, or even to, the Mexican society? Is it really actually different with Bolsonaro or Trump, or do they have common ground? So what do you see? What can you tell us about AMLO's approach? Thanks a lot, David.
Yeah, thank you very much to all of you. It's amazing because I think there is no much difference. In December 2018, a government that assumed itself to be leftist came to the presidency of the Republic of Mexico, and it used a very well-known language of populism, attacking the elites as the one to blame for the country situation and rampant corruption that these elites, never very well defined, obviously had forgotten the people, also not very well defined. And it is the leader's job, evidently, to put things in order and to turn the government to serve the poor and the people, disarming the mafia that the elites had built inside and outside the government. So the language is very similar. Under the motto, there can be no rich government with poor people. Very, very good motto, by the way. This government launched the idea that an austere government, austere as to reach level of Franciscan poverty, AMLO says, it's the main propaganda that launched a huge attack on public administration at several levels at the level of federal government. The president begins to reduce salaries at the high levels of the bureaucracy and ordered a massive cutback of positions and programs in the public administrations. These cuts have affected not only the traditional bureaucracy, but also the health system, even in the years of the pandemic, the economic promotion organizations, public organizations, and also science and education, surprisingly. Not only the main bureaucracy, but science, education, and the health system have suffered huge budget cuts and also attacks in this sense. It is curious because if we see the numbers today, actually federal government is the same size as in the past. I guess these ideas of downsizing bureaucracy actually was a rebuilding and placing some people closer to the dominant party in public administration, because the downsizing hasn't been actually produced. All the money is going now to three major, huge public projects. The new airport in Mexico City that was also preceded by the cancellation and very high, very costly issue of cancellation of the one that was already being built, a tourist train in the south of the country, and also a refinery in the same state where the president born, by the way. When then in this sense, the attack against the corrupt elites has been expanding. Now these corrupt elites exist in public universities, in autonomous bodies that regulate political or economic issues, in media, as well in other groups that criticize the government's policies. Even the children with cancer who still cannot get medicine today in Mexico have been named as coup perpetrators. I mean, amazing as it sounds. Only two sectors of the public administration have seen their resources grow. Those who manage the anti-poverty assistance programs, direct allocations of resources, and the armed forces. The latter have been put in charge of building airports, administering ports, transporting vaccines, among many other activities. And now we have the project of the army to run the National Guard that by law supposed to be civilian. But now there is a project in the Congress in Mexico to place the civilian police under the military structure. Faced then with the dismantling of an important part of public administration, some questions have arisen. But I think one is very important: how it is possible to dismantle and deprofessionalize the administrative apparatus in Mexico at this level of aggressiveness. The answer is very simple. The difference in Brazil or United States, in Mexico, we don't have a civil service career, so it is very easy to transform and move. The spoil system is actually very legitimized in Mexico. And the government or the administration has a lot of discretionality to remove and change the structure of public administration, because in Mexico the political system is based on the spoil system at this day. So that's a big trouble, because we don't have the kind of guerrilla resistance that you can see in the United States or in Brazil. In Mexico, it's very hard to find that kind of capacity. Well, then the Mexican case today, I think, is one that can apply, it's the case that we can recall important arguments about the necessity of a democratic public administration. I remember Waldo or Wurtzel or Mary O'Leary talking about the necessity to discuss and discuss the issue of how public administration should be also democratic and should be protected by a democratic system. In Spain and Brazil, we also have people like Regina Silvia Pacheco, Maria Carmen Pardo, who also have talked about the issue of the necessity to discuss the democratic sides of public administration and not only the technocratic or the administrative part of the public administration. Populism, I think, is based on the denial of one of the most important lessons of public administration in the last 50 years. Good intention and discourse of infallibility in public policy may well create major disasters, as James Scott showed. Incrementalism, the distribution and the devolution of responsibilities, multi-centers of power and organization, the overlapping of jurisdictions have shown their ability at least to reduce the likelihood of fiascos or huge governmental errors in the medium or in the long term. These lessons learned from public administration are set aside, I think, by the populism discourse of infallibility, where ideology is sufficient to ensure the success of governmental action. Some argue, as Laclau and Moffett does today, that populism might create a truer democracy. But what a democratic public administration shows is that concentrating power, abandoning skepticism regarding public policy decision-making, and assuming, a heroism that presumes infallibility in the organization and implementation of public administration seems to be recipes for fiasco. How to restore confidence to democratic public administration that appreciates diversity accepts dialogue and has a strong skepticism as a principle or as a basis for correcting errors in public policy. A democratic public administration is an intricate, fallible but correctable activity faced with the onslaught of simplification and the populist spell. I think that promises quick, easy, and infallible solutions. The challenge of restoring confidence in democratic public administration is far from simple, I guess. So, a lot of similarities, I guess, Alec. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Just as a background question, despite all of this, Pablo looks to be pretty much more popular, at least, than Bolsonaro. So at least we have we're not sure about his support yet, but it's probably around 30%, while AMLO still is keeping his popularity levels very high. So at the next round, I'd like to hear more about this resilience also of Trump. I mean, Trump is in the US or AMLO in Mexico. Of course, we had a good answer from David and Dawn talking about administrative capacity, or because they are there or because they don't exist, being like a condition, to kind of limit the political control of those this type of populist leaders. But yet there's still ground, to discuss the legitimizing grounds, the social supports that these leaders still maintain in their society. And then I would like to ask Johan to jump in the debate. Johan has been working on the historical perspective on populism. Unfortunately, even in Brazil, we've seen not so long time ago, we've went through a dictatorship. We went through a historical nightmare, and that was kind of, we thought that was suppressed by, the democratization wave. And we've seen a role, even negative role of bureaucracy, collaborating with authoritarianism, with dictatorship sometimes in the history. But I'd like to hear from Johan, what can we learn, from the history, if we can learn something? Thanks a lot, Johan.
Thanks a lot. Let me just try to share my screen. Hopefully that works. Yes, does that work?
Yes, it's working.
Yes. Okay. Perfect. Okay. Thanks a lot for the chance to talk here at the conference. So I'm from Leiden University in the Netherlands, and together with my colleague Kutal Yesolkagit, we've been doing some research on populism and public administration, including on historical cases of authoritarian populism. And given the timing of this conference, I just couldn't resist the temptation to talk about Italy. Because before you have elections in Brazil and before we have the midterm elections in the US, Italy has parliamentary elections that are coming up on Sunday, actually. And it is very likely, almost certain, I would say, based on the polls, there's been a polling silence for a while now, but it's very likely that Giorgia Meloni, who's the leader of the far-right Fratelli d'Italia party, also known as the Brothers of Italy in English, will be Italy's next prime minister. And she'll most likely lead a majority coalition of right-wing parties that also includes the right-wing populist Lega party and Silvio Berlusconi's Forza Italia party. So a populist trio in power. Coincidentally, this fall, it's also the 100th anniversary of Mussolini's rise to power. So at the end of October 1922, the armed insurrection known as the March on Rome convinced the Italian king to ask Mussolini to form a government. And this was the beginning of the dismantling of Italy's democratic institutions and more than 20 years of fascist rule in Italy. So In fact, Meloni would be Italy's first far-right leader since Mussolini. And the parallels are almost too obvious not to be discussed, right? And indeed, some people fear a return to the fascist past, were Meloni to come to power at the head of a majority government. So for instance, this is from today, today's issue of the German weekly Stern. Meloni is the most dangerous woman in Europe. So 100 years after the March on Rome, are there reasons to be afraid of another round of democratic backsliding and authoritarian rule in Italy? Can history be any guide? First of all, it is true that there are ideological parallels. Meloni's Fratelli d'Italia party has its roots in the neo-fascist or post-fascist movement, basically the political movement that survived after the war. It is a conservative and a nationalist party. It has links to other far-right parties elsewhere, including Trump's Republican Party, Vox in Spain. So, for instance, just as the war in Ukraine started, Giorgia Meloni was giving a speech at the CPAC, Conservative Political Action Conference in Orlando, Florida. So her ideological alignment is clear in that sense. Another parallel with Mussolini is Meloni's ideological flexibility, right? So her public statements constantly shift between pretty moderate positions and hard right positions, depending on the audience. And it's difficult to know what her true intentions are. And this was also one of Mussolini's greatest political gifts, this kind of constant ability to reassure on the one hand in one speech and fire up his base in the next moment, and also something that helped him maneuver into power 100 years ago. On the other hand, there are some very important differences between 2022 and 1922. So first of all, the social and political context is completely different. So it's important to remember that Mussolini rose to power at the moment of very deep social and political unrest in Italy. So this includes, on the one hand, anti-system threats, not only from Mussolini himself, of course, but also from the left, from the communists, who wanted to overthrow the democratic system. It was a period of widespread political violence. It was also a period where, in which the political class was really unable to govern and maintain order. So this in the years after World War I. Today, of course, Italians do face problems. Rising gas bills, that's all they talk about in the electoral campaign. More persistent problems like underdevelopment in the south, corruption, red tape, government inefficiency, you name it. Yet still, on many counts, Italy is doing better than it has been in a while, and that's important to recognize, right? So just one example of this. Last year, The Economist, the magazine, named Italy Country of the Year. And that was largely based on the Draghi government's successful handling of the pandemic, and generally competent handling of many things over the last year and a half. And it's important to recognize that Draghi's government did not fall because he was unable to govern or unable to address the challenges facing Italy, as was the case in 1922, where basically the old political class collapsed and went home. But the Draghi government fell because of political calculations within the governing coalition, where the right-wing parties, and it looks like correctly, saw great opportunities from going to new elections. Also in the 1920s, Mussolini was able to get to power and dismantle Italy's democratic institutions in part because there were no viable political alternatives. And that's very different today in the sense that there are alternatives. I mean, I think Draghi has shown, for instance, that another technocratic government is a very real alternative should the right-wing government fail. And technocratic governments are an Italian specialty, or a center-right government. Another important difference between 2022 and 1922 is Italy's political and administrative institutions, or their democratic institutions. So 100 years ago, Italy's democratic institutions were relatively new, and they were fragile in many ways, right? So the so-called liberal state of the time had underlying authoritarian elements that were easily exploited by Mussolini once he kind of came to power. Also, the Italian king played a very controversial role in this period by basically enabling Mussolini's power grab in 22. And in the following years, failing to defend Italy's democratic institutions. And many people were looking to the king, right? So he was in many ways should have been the grantor of the institutions, but did not step in. Today, these institutions, the democratic institutions, are of course far more robust, and there are multiple checks on the executive. So first of all, the Italian president has an important role as grantor of the institutions, and President Mattarella, who was re-elected recently, has also shown that he's willing to take a very activist role in defending the institutions, right? So during the previous populist government, which was the coalition of the Lega party and the Five-Star movement, so this is 3-4 years ago, Mattarella actually blocked the nomination of a Eurosceptic as Minister of the Economy on the grounds that this was a threat to Italy's credibility on the financial markets and its membership of the euro. So, constitutionally speaking, he was going out on a limb, and not everyone would say that this was completely legitimate as an action, but just shows how far Mattarella has been willing to go to defend the institutions. Second, Italy is, of course, member of the EU and the euro, and that also poses a number of constraints on democratic backsliding that were not there 100 years ago, obviously. To be sure, the cases of Poland and Hungary show that also EU countries can backslide, but we also see that Europe is increasingly dealing with this issue, right, and using its toolbox to counteract attempts at backsliding. And Italy is also not Poland and Hungary. And I think any moves to dismantle democratic institutions would be taken very, very seriously, and perhaps even more seriously than these other cases in Brussels, Italy being a founding member of the European Union. And third, moving to the more administrative institutions here, the research out there has shown that Italy's administrative institutions are extremely hard to change, right? And for good and for bad. I mean, they're almost impossible to reform. There's some interesting research by Di Mascio and colleagues, which basically shows that under previous populist governments, and there have been a lot of them in Italy, starting with Berlusconi in 1994, continuing with the Lega and the Five-Star movement. Previous populist governments have not in any significant way been able to reshape the Italian public administration. So not only have the populists showed little interest in dismantling or occupying the administrative state, they've also lacked the skills and the personnel to do so. In the Italian state, an important feature of the Italian state is that the permanent administration is highly detached from politics. It is formalist, it is legalist, it is obstructionist, and thus very difficult to change for any reformer, whether that's a populist government or someone with other intentions. Instead, in the Italian system, much of the actual policy work happens within the ministerial cabinets, which is what you have in France also, for instance, which are politically appointed and thus would be politicized under any kind of government. But also here the research shows that these cabinets, of course, rely on competent and experienced staff, and previous populist governments have to a large extent picked officials from the same pool of candidates as other governments. And I think that's just a reflection of the fact that the populist parties in Italy, including the ones that will most likely come to power on Sunday, do not really have an alternative lineup of ideologically loyal candidates who can fill these positions. So to conclude, and this is maybe a more positive note than the previous two presentations. It is, of course, true that the Meloni-led right-wing government may have a significant impact on domestic and foreign policy in Italy. But it's difficult to see how a Meloni government would lead to a slide into fascism or constitute a threat to democracy of the kind posed by Trump or Bolsonaro. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Johan. Interesting, as you learned about the role of the institutional watchdogs, among them, the very role of the bureaucracy with strong administrative capacities being particularly relevant. And I do think that we have some of that in Brazil, and we're still facing, a very ambiguous future in terms of what can we expect after the election day. So this would be like another question on the table, as I welcome other questions or comments from the audience, and also would like to invite Michele, which has been working on particularly gathering empirical data about the Brazilian bureaucracy, along with other Brazilian researchers that are, very much concerned with the impact of Bolsonarism within the Brazilian public sector, Brazilian democracy, Brazilian society as a whole. So thank you, Michele, for coming. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Pecci. It's an honor to be here. It's my first time at ENAPAD, so I'm really happy to be able to contribute to the discussion today. I'm afraid that I'm not going to be able to continue on the positive note that Johan left us. I think my research has been much more along the lines of what our first two speakers talked about. And as Professor Moynihan pointed out, I too were not, in the past, a researcher of the bureaucracy. I have a sort of a large-scale research project going on human rights and human rights policies, and that's what brought me to research the bureaucracy. And as part of that larger research and interviewing civil servants and especially federal workers in Brazil over 2 years, I started identifying patterns that were not really as part of my research project, and I started paying attention to those patterns. And that has turned out to be really interesting work that connects my research, not only in terms of human rights, but in terms of public policies in general, and especially what we call policy dismantling. So some of the data that I will present to you today is within that broader discussion of policy dismantling processes happening in Brazil since the beginning of 2019 with the start of the Bolsonaro government. So I'll start with this picture, which will be familiar with for our Brazilian audience, but not as much for maybe my colleagues on the panel. So this is a sort of a very famous scene from a movie called Elite Squad, which I think is available on Netflix. And this shows, the character Captain Nascimento dealing with, one of the members of his group, and he uses the phrase, you have to ask out, right? You have to ask to leave the squad. So he's basically intimidating him with the use of physical force and telling him that he needs to go, but he has to ask to go. So instead of telling him he should be, fired, he has to ask to exit. And, sometimes when we think of fear and intimidation in the civil service, we may expect a scene like this, right? Something very visual, very material, with the use of, very explicit harassment, right? And in some instances, we'll be a little closer to this. But what I have found in my research is that this kind of intimidation and fear can materialize in many different ways, and it can take a very collective form. So it's not only the individual who's threatened or who is harassed that will have this fear and will be impacted by intimidation. It also creates sort of a collective sentiment, right? That is really contagious to a whole institution or even to civil service as a whole. So, with that sort of image in mind and thought in mind, I will tell you, a little bit of the framing of my research. And so the data I'll show to you today has to do with this question of, the perceptions of the Brazilian federal bureaucracy in terms of processes of policy dismantling. And some of you have used the term dismantling to refer to institutions or to policies. But in policy studies, I draw from a literature that has understood policy dismantling as being, either the reduction in policy instruments or sometimes the complete erosion, but it doesn't have to materialize as a sort of total erasure of a policy. It can be, more subtle processes of reduction in policy, either, by what they call reducing density or intensity of policies. So I wanted to get the perspectives, right, of the Brazilian federal bureaucracy in terms of policy dismantling. I have worked with a number of colleagues now in Brazil who are dedicated to studying specific cases of policy dismantling, cases from the environmental sector, which have become internationally known, cases of policy dismantling referring to human rights policies, racial equality policies, health policies, education policies. So, as a group of researchers, we have identified that, the case of Brazil really stands out as being this massive process of policy dismantling in various sectors. Which is also not only explicit, but also intentional, right? And in trying to understand the perspectives of bureaucrats in this framework of policy dismantling, I came to identify very interesting patterns and just sentiments and perceptions that they were voicing to me, which I would like to present to you today. So just for you to understand, the policy dismantling literature and where it comes from, I'm not going to take too long here, and I'd be happy to discuss that later with you. But it's a literature that comes actually from Europe and from scholars like Michael Bauer and others who work with the concept to understand policy reduction in context of fiscal limitations, right? When you have fiscal restructuring and you have fewer resources and you need to reduce some policies to adjust to that fiscal objective. So we use that literature as sort of the basis and sort of the conceptual support of our work on policy dismantling. But we have found that policy dismantling happening in context of democratic backsliding has taken some different features in comparison to that original process of policy dismantling that Michael Bauer and his colleagues were trying to identify in Europe, right? So the question is, what do we have here in this context of populism, especially right-wing populism, that sets policy dismantling apart from that original process? And in trying to understand this question, I've been drawing from some literature that actually comes from administration, and especially public administration, in looking at the behavior of the bureaucracy, right? And what are the options that the bureaucracy has? So Guy Peters and Guedes Neto, João Guedes Neto, they have used the concepts of work, shirking, and sabotage to understand the possibilities that the bureaucracy is given, right, in contexts that are marked by undemocratic projects, right? And in their research, they're going to say, well, at least in this experiment that we ran, the bureaucracy in this municipality of Brazil will tend to shirk and not comply with an undemocratic project, but they will not sabotage either, right? So this tells a little bit of the limitations of our expectations for resistance, right? And how much the bureaucracy can really resist and can really put together sort of a guerrilla government, right? To use the words of O'Leary. So in the case of the federal bureaucracy in Brazil, I've instead opted for other possibilities, right? So I've rather used Hirschman's exit, voice, and loyalty as being the possibilities, because in the case of the federal civil service in Brazil, of course, you have the option to exit civil service in general, but you also have more subtle possibilities of exiting, right? You can ask to move to a different agency. You can ask to go work in a different city. You can move within your own agency to a different department. So the bureaucracy can actually mobilize different possibilities of exit. And this is something that has been very much present in the Brazilian federal administration in the past years. So this a general overview. The data comes from a survey with over 300 respondents and 132 interviews that we got to code with NVivo. So let me tell you the outcomes. So we asked two questions in terms of bureaucrats' individual career choices, right? And I was just listening to David talking about the situation in Mexico, and I was wondering if this could be a potential difference with the Brazilian public service, which is we have a good number of tenured civil servants. Tenure in federal work in Brazil has been very much under attack after so many attempts at reforming and doing administrative reform. And it turns out that tenure is something that has been protecting the Brazilian civil service against, all the processes that I will talk about, including intimidation. So this actually makes civil servants not leave the state in general, and you're going to see that, that's a sort of a small percentage of what people did. But they resorted to different exit possibilities to the point that between the 2016 impeachment process and Bolsonaro's election in 2018, only a third of my respondents actually stayed in the same position and the same institution. And that's also true for what happened after Bolsonaro's election in 2018. So you have a revolving door of the federal bureaucracy in Brazil as a result of democratic backsliding. And you can only imagine, right, what that does to public policies, right, and to public institutions in general. If people are trying to exit and to leave and occupy spaces where they feel protected and where they also feel a little invisible and therefore not as threatened. So I'm going to bring to you some of the quotes from my respondents. And I think it's important to highlight that people were really afraid. They were really scared to talk to us. So we have to give them all kinds of reassurances that their identities would not be disclosed. So I really took the time to try to sort of erase any kind of reference to their institutions, their kind of careers, gender, and so on. So, one of them will say, all civil servants of my former department left and went to other departments. I negotiated my transfer to another area, which did not work with the topic of my personal interest. But that is what was possible at that time. You keep trying to find a place where it is possible to survive, right? This is the feeling that I have. So I think my decision to move had to do with that. A search for a place where it is possible to work with some sense of dignity, and that is the bottom line. So you have this underlying movement of people trying to escape what they perceive to be, situations that are dangerous to them, not in the physical sense, right? But sometimes in the moral sense, in having them do a kind of work that they do not agree with, or with leaders that have an agenda that are contrary to their values, or even some possibilities of facing administrative consequences for what their opinions are, or the kind of work that they have done in the past. Civil service in Brazil has also been marked by a more active situation of removal of individuals from their positions and institutional dismantling. So you have all these processes happening at the same time. You have some institutions that have been dismantled just wholesale. You have people who have been actively removed from their positions, and then individuals who have, quote and unquote, voluntarily chosen to leave their positions because they're too afraid, right? So this one says, I worked in the sector until the beginning of 2019, precisely until January 2019, when the secretariat where this person worked was extinguished. The general coordination where I worked from 2006 to 16, and in fact, the whole department were extinguished at that time. There have been no policies for this topic at this ministry since that time. So a whole process of not only policy dismantling, but also institutional dismantling. And this is something, that for people who have been working with these topics for the longest time, it really hits them hard. So the policies were in a limbo. They formally still existed, but in practice, there was no specific sector responsible for them. And then the people who work with these sectors or with these policies, they were, either fired if they were only political appointees, but if they were tenured civil servants, they would move to work somewhere else. And then there was fear and intimidation along the lines of what Professor Moynihan said. And I think this is a very representative line here. So this interviewee says, things were bad during the Temer administration with the starting of the dismantling processes, but nothing compared to Bolsonaro. The ability to make things worse seems endless. Now everything is very fragile. The difference is that now we are afraid. Before, we were afraid in relation to our career. Well, maybe I will lose my senior position. Maybe I will be stigmatized. But now we are afraid of being really persecuted. I made a presentation about a proposal that existed to amend the Constitution, and the person who invited me to make the presentation later called and said, I was worried about you because you were very critical to the current fiscal rules. And then she says, of course, we're all afraid, but we also have courage. So there is this combination of people being afraid, trying to react, but there are limitations in terms of how much they can react. So just to put this within, going back to the bigger framework of policy dismantling, you have sort of a dangerous vicious cycle. And I think this is especially concerning for developing countries, right? And here thinking of Brazil and thinking of Mexico as well, in which you have sort of a cycle where the dismantling of policies and institutions push bureaucrats to exit, not necessarily, sort of leaving civil service altogether, but, exiting the places where they used to work, where, they were the specialists in specific policies. And this leads to a very concerning reduction in policy capacity and the prospects for better policies that are needed by these countries, right? So it really generates a vicious cycle of policy dismantling within, a process of capacity erosion. Thank you very much. I'm sorry, I probably extended the time that was given to me, but thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Michele. I would like to invite everybody that wants to comment or pose a question. You can also turn on the camera or the audio. At least I asked for our support to allow that everybody can turn on the camera. I don't know if it's working, but if you can't, just write it down. Yes, Mario, you can turn your audio on, and the camera too, by the way.
No, I'm just going to turn my my camera on because well, actually it's working.
It's working.
So,
yeah.
Thank you very much. So thank you very much for all of you for all your presentations. They were very interesting in terms of trying to bring some ideas to the discussion of populism. But I would like to address specifically to Michelle a question. What is interesting here? Well, I don't know. There is also a phenomenon here that has been studied here, at least in the last 10 years, about bureaucratic activism and the connections between bureaucracy and social movements. which were very powerful, for example, to design and to implement some policies in the last 15 years. And what I would like you to comment or to try to understand if aren't we also watching a similar movement in terms of bureaucratic activism from the other side, from the regressive side? Because why I'm telling this? Because I do think that even in terms of Bolsonaro's, there is support from part of the bureaucracy. And one main example is his chancellor Ernest, the other Ernest, I can't remember his name, was part of the bureaucracy in Itamaraty, for example. He was chosen by someone and has changed the way and the perspective, the policies are there. So I just would like to make Ernesto Araújo. Thank you very much, Gabriel. So that's it. So I would like to listen a little bit more about this kind of things. And of course, well, that's it. Okay.
Thank you so much, Mario. That's an excellent question, and it gives me the chance of being a little more optimistic. So, and the reason is that in my broader research, right, and not only in talking about policy dismantling, I've been looking into this category that I have called human rights bureaucrats, right? So I'm trying to understand people's values and how much they value the role of the state in protecting and promoting human rights. And with that part of the research, one of the things that I found is, well, first of all, bureaucrats very much reject the idea of being activists with whatever definition of activism that they have, right? So, I've been in conversation with Rebecca Abers, who is, one of the proponents of the idea of bureaucratic activism. And I think there is a difference to be said between bureaucratic activism that is a representation of people's activism in civil society. And once they are able to become a part of the state, they bring that activism with them, right? But it's a result of a socialization process that happened before they came to work for the government. What I see in my research in terms of human rights bureaucrats is a socialization process that actually happened within the state. So these are civil servants who are who value human rights, but who were never activists and who do not see themselves as activists, right? So even when you think of progressive civil servants, many of them will not call themselves activists, even though they're very much progressive, and even though they will, of course, feel threatened by Bolsonaro's political agenda, they do not see themselves as activists, right? So that is an interesting point. When we think of conservative or right-wing activism, and we look at the current bureaucracy in Brazil, what I see with the people that I have interviewed is that the sort of strongly ideological commitment of federal civil servants is really a small percentage of the collaboration of the federal bureaucracy with the Bolsonaro government, right? The collaborators do it rather for personal interest, right? Because they want to accede to specific positions, so that's why they collaborate. Some of them may collaborate because there's no one else to do it, right? And apart from military appointments and religious appointments, in some specific sectors, Bolsonaro has not been able to bring his own people. So he has had to count on the professional bureaucracy, and there are those who have stepped up to the plate and said, I will do it because otherwise it's going to be worse for all of us. So it's a sort of non-ideological collaboration, and for some of them out of personal interest for getting higher salaries. And that is to say that I only see a small fraction of collaboration that is truly ideological in the lines of Ernesto Araújo that I just mentioned. And I think his case is also an interesting case because he was able to turn Brazilian foreign policy towards, the Bolsonaro agenda for the very beginning. But then once he left the position, I think the Brazilian diplomacy has been trying to get back to track to how Brazilian foreign policy used to be. And I think one good example of that is if you compare Bolsonaro's opening speech to the UN General Assembly in 2019 to what we saw 2 days ago, you saw the work of the professional bureaucracy and the professional diplomacy back on track, right? So I would say 80%, 85% of that speech was written by the professional diplomacy, and maybe 15% of it was written by, the president's sort of closer group. I'm more optimistic in this sense. I don't think we have seen so much right-wing activism being sort of performed by the Brazilian professional bureaucracy. What I worry is that, with the pandemic and home officing and so on, how are you going to re-engage the federal bureaucracy that has been living in fear and intimidation for so long, right? So for me, the question is, what's going to happen in the coming years?
Thank you, Mario. Thank you, Michelle. As we wait for other comments or questions, I would like to extend to Mario's observations about, what the question of institutional watchdog. Do you see within the bureaucracy one of those institutional watchdogs to defend democracy, or within other social players, nonprofit sector, business sectors, or whatever? I mean, do you think it's emerging within each context? And another question that I would like to pose is about the role of inequality in, growing populism worldwide. It's a question do you see a role, for this striking inequality that's kind of shaping the way that Brazil is inspiring inversely the world today. So it used to be one of the most unequal countries in the world, and we know how much problems we had because of that. But now, unfortunately, inequality is going on the rise for a long time in many developed countries. So David, Don, Johan, you can jump in and contribute to this broader question, and also pose other comments. David is on the line. Thanks, Dave.
Yeah, I would like to ask a question to Johan, Donald, and Michelle. And I wonder if you have seen the same phenomenon that in Mexico. I mean, one of the main arguments of current government is that public administration is easy, in Mexico. It's something that doesn't require any science. It is something quite simple, or a matter of will and a matter of honesty. So we don't need complex institutions and structures and resources, because it is a matter of will, And so public administration is not a science. It's something simple that can be applied. And that's the main argument that the president and the government has used in order to, dismantle and transform. And obviously now delivering all the, several structures of the public administration to the military, because the president says the military are honest, are capable, and they are very loyal. So that's the only thing we need for public administration in our country. I wonder if that same discourse appears in Brazil, United States, in Italy, or in the experience that Johan also studies. Thank you.
I can go first. I don't think that has quite the same resonance in the US, but it does harken back to an earlier era of Jacksonian populism. So when you saw the spoil system take hold for the first time in the United States, when President Jackson was in power, it was based on that premise that public sector work was so simple that it required no special protections, that one could simply, hire anyone and they would be equally good as the person who'd been in place for 10 years. I think our current framing is just more negatively attributed towards the motivations of public servants rather than their capacities. I do think it, and this, I would link this back to Al-Qaeda's question about institutions protecting democracy in this case, which in many cases ends up being the military, right? And that's always a very risky proposition when you're relying on the military to defend democratic institutions, because that can run either way. But you could see what's happening in Mexico with the favoring of the military, and I think to some degree in Brazil as well, as a way to shore up and gain favor with one institution that can credibly push back against democratic backsliding if they so wished. And I think in the United States, there are quotes around the time of the end of Trump's first term in office among military leaders where they're basically saying they can't do this without us, and essentially as long as we hold together, we will be okay. My concern is that, and this touches on Johann's point earlier about the deep bench of loyalists and the lack of that among populist parties, is that they will learn over time, and that President Trump, if he comes back, will not appoint the same set of chiefs of staff of the military, will not have the same people running security services. And so we'll be better at using formal power more aggressively to erode those institutions that had presented some resistance to his control next time out.
This is a very good reminder because Venezuela is too close to be, to work as a good example of the dangers ahead. It's playing a long time with populism or authoritarianism. It might be very dangerous both ways, and everybody learns how to surpass the roles of institutional defense and watchdogs. Johan?
Yeah, sure. Happy to jump in. Just picking up on a few points. I think that's absolutely true, right? There's probably a learning process on the populist side here. On the other hand, over time, the populist might also become domesticated, right? So you can kind of have both processes going on depending a bit on what movement you're talking about. And in that sense, interactions with the bureaucracy can, of course, also give populist parties a sense of what it is governing and of the actual competencies in the bureaucracy. Just to pick on the question of institutional watchdogs, I think in the Italian case, the judicial system also plays an extremely important role. So for instance, there's a strong constitutional court, right, which is another institutional check on many of the kinds of attempts at backsliding one could think about. And finally, the question from David, is have we seen this? The public administration is so simple, we can just cut it back. I think in Italy, there's less of this direct, criticism of the efficiency of the bureaucracy, but that's kind of, everyone agrees on that, right? So that's not something that's limited to the populists. I think the specific populist criticisms in this regard have been, there's been a lot of discourse against kind of this, what's called assistenzialismo in Italian, basically government handouts, right? So all the right parties are against the government handouts that were introduced by the five-star movements, for instance, and that's one of the big policy issues now, and is something that will probably be repealed if the right comes to power. And there's also this anti-bureaucratic critique, which is directed at Brussels, right? So it's not directed at the Italian bureaucracy, but it's directed at the bureaucrats in Brussels. But then the question is more, it's more of a sovereignty issue than really a bureaucratic issue or an argument that the institutions in Brussels are not working well. But there is a little bit of this. Giorgia Meloni talks about, for instance, the EU should be more of a political union and less of a bureaucratic or technocratic union. So I think there is a sense that they want to rebalance also the European cooperation and give the member states a more central position in decision making.
We have some questions. We have a question about the resilience of Bolsonarism or right more broadly in terms of, anti-democratic values, anti-institutional values, anti-bureaucracy, anti-public service values. Comments going on saying that basically it's been all around for a long time. Then it become crystallized, materialized within the government, but probably will not get rid of it because we changed the government, as probably the US case is demonstrated right now. There is still a chance that Trumpism might be back in one form or another. So what do you suggest? So how can we kind of, surpass the dangers of this resilience of those normative values in our context? Probably Don and David can contribute on that. And I also like to ask David about the high levels of support of AMLO. It's still an open question because probably you answer part of that when you talk about anti-poverty programs, etc. But is this enough, to maintain such high support levels within the society? So if you can comment on that, thanks a lot. Don and David.
I'll let David go first this time.
Okay. Well, I'm still struggling, trying to understand or to build the rationale, the logic. It is quite tempting to assume that when populists dismantle democratic institutions or organization or public administration, they do not have a clear or solid argument, solid in some sense, some in terms of causality, stuff like that. And I think, my guess is that they have, there is a rationale behind several of the issues. For example, in the case of Mexico, this argument of the public administration being something simple, something that doesn't require a science, it is a matter of political will and honesty, has been very catchy for population. And, it's a way of argumenting or making an argument regarding why bureaucracy in Mexico and everywhere is so slow or so the idea that they are also building new institutions, perhaps not the best institutions, perhaps not very stable or institutions that defend the freedom of people or plurality or complexity or argumentation and debate regarding public policies, but they are building institutions, I guess. But I'm still struggling with the idea because it is very easy, to simple saying that they are destroying things, and the difficult part is to understand what they are building if they are building something. But I'm still struggling with the idea.
Yeah, I'll touch on the sort of inequality part of it. And I think one thing you see with the rhetoric of populism, at least in the United States, is that it has a certain experimental element to it. So, the genius of Trump is that he would say absolutely anything, and he would say what would work, and he would continue with the themes that were getting the most attention and the most responses. And so Trump in 2016, there was sort of this vague nod towards equality, towards protecting important social programs. In reality, his actions as president were antagonistic towards those goals. His major legislative achievement was a tax cut that benefited the very wealthy. And I think at this point, there isn't really even the nod towards this idea of social equity. Indeed, a lot of the rhetoric is centered on, attacking the grievances of the various groups that are being classified as enemies of the populist movement. And so instead, the emphasis on elitism, at least in the US, has almost no tangible monetary or social policy aspect to it, as best as one can tell. It's generally through these culture war lenses where the elites are including your local school teacher, as well as the people who work in the federal government, as having some cultural advantage, or as looking at the world where they are, they don't share your values and they look down on you. And that sort of version of equity is very powerful, I think, because it appeals to grievance, even though it doesn't particularly leave anyone better off in terms of access to resources.
Yes, and this brings to the other questions, which it talks about the role of this, the populists to be connected with, to make use of, the deep fake infodemics, fake news, etc. It looks like in a more coordinated form and coordinated international coordination is going on, particularly within the right-wing parties and government. And I don't know if you see a role on that, as we see, a fragmentation of left-wing parties in many international contexts. We do see, on the contrary, a movement of, consolidation of the right-wing parties or movement. We see similar cultural movement in Brazil, for example. We never had something like children not going to the school, and now we have homeschooling, as a strategy, as a governmental strategy, as a being. So those are the cultural movements that are independently. Where is going on? Where is the populist in place? So do you see a role in that? So on the role of infodemics, the capacity to coordinate the right-wing movements worldwide, etc. Are they impacting our societies or not?
Okay, I think I can go first. Also because I think the question in terms of what happens next, right, is very important to us. And in knowing both realities, right, both researching Brazil and living in the US, I think there is a continued organization, right, of the basis for right-wing populists. There is a global connection between them, which is, I think, is unprecedented, right? My experience is that it's not very often that you see foreign leaders coming to the US by the invitation of political parties in the way that the Republican Party has done to Orban, has done to, the Italian candidate, and will probably do to Bolsonaro in the future. So that level of organization, I think, is something that is here to stay. I think the permeation of some ideas and agendas at the state level is something that is very present in the US, how states have become true laboratories for some discourses, even though the national government is no longer controlled by Trump. I live in a Republican state, in actually a very progressive town, which has not made a difference currently because there are state policies enacted by a Republican governor that establishes really harsh bans and prohibitions in the field of education. So there are topics that we can no longer talk about in the classroom. If you have kids in the public schools, they're not going to be able to read specific books, even though you're going to say there are no banned books. That's not true. So I think those ramifications are something that we should definitely be paying attention to, right? Once that movement leaves the centers of power, I think they will continue existing in civil society, and I think this is something to watch for.
Great. Does anyone else want to comment, or these are other questions?
Well, I would just note that you can find funding for many of our right movements in Europe coming from the direction of the East, including Russia, as well as online propagation of information in America, also having sources that come from outside the US. And so there's some element of coordination that does go on, I think, by groups who have perhaps a less positive view of liberal democracies.
Then, with this important observation, I'd like to conclude with one last question. How can we rebuild? Is it possible, to go to go in another, to go through a populist society, populist government, and still rebuild in a democratic background. So what is your final thoughts about that?
So I think one thing we can all do here is that we do research and we have some sort of public voice in a way that I think people who are actually working in bureaucracy do not have and may feel constrained in expressing. And I think to the general public, it's very easy not to see damage that this sort of democratic backsliding has on the quality of government as well as personal freedoms, because it's the classic things are getting worse degree by degree, where it's hard to really observe from day to day how your life has changed. So I think we have some opportunity and maybe responsibility to highlight and explain the very real long-term costs based on our research and our knowledge of this area without being overly dramatic, but while sticking to facts and saying, you know, if we continue down this road, here is what history teaches us, here's what our research tells us about what the consequences will be.
David, Johan, Michelle, do you want to jump in?
Yes, I guess that perhaps we need also to become more autocritical, you know, in terms of accepting that we have failed in several ways to explain people the importance of public administration, the importance of institutions, the importance and complexities of public action, and the importance of pluralism in developing public policies. And at least in Mexico, what I see is that people is eager to believe that it is a simple matter, that it is not a complex issue, and that public administration is based on political will and honesty. And I guess once we face the future fiascos that we are going to have, I have no doubt in the case of Mexico, we need to explain better why it's important to have pluralism, democratic values, strong institutions, and a strong public administration, but in a very autocritical way. I guess we cannot, at least in the case of Mexico, once again return to the idea of technocratic visions, technical, and it is a matter of experts only to develop public institution. It's a matter of society also, and I think that some kind of autocritical capacity in our side in public administration studies might be important once we face the consequences of the situation we are dealing now with.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and maybe one thing which is, well, maybe also a little bit of a positive note, right? I think an important thing is also to integrate these populist forces in the system, right? And that happens partly through governing experience. I mean, I'm from Norway, for instance. We have had a populist right party in government, and the experience here, and then Norway is a very different setting from the countries that we're talking about here, is that that was the force that moderated the populist party, and I'm pretty sure we're going to see the same thing in Sweden with the Sweden Democrats in government or supporting the government. Also, Berlusconi was a huge anti-system figure in the early 1990s. Now he's much more of a centrist force, right? So I think also these kind of forces that push the parties into the system and towards the center are important, instead of just kind of closing them out and hoping they'll go away, right? Because many of them will not necessarily just disappear like that.
Michelle?
Yeah, I think, I agree with what everybody said. I would just add 2 points. One is, if there is a change in administration, just in the way that we have seen here in the US, if that happens in Brazil as well, my one top suggestion would be, do not go after identifying or trying to identify collaborators. I don't think that is worth it. I don't think we can spare the energy and the resources to trying to identify who collaborated and who didn't. I think we have to basically find a way to re-engage the bureaucracy. And I think that's the central question to rebuilding public policies and to rebuilding public administration that has been, strongly traumatized, right? So whoever comes to power after a kind of government that intimidates and persecutes civil servants, you're going to find a very traumatized group of bureaucrats, and you're going to need them to work for you. So I think thinking carefully about how to re-engage the bureaucracy after these kinds of experiences is really important. If I think of, the teachers here in my school district who are having to go through their entire libraries to prove that those books, each and every book, is age appropriate. If I were that teacher, I would leave the teaching profession, altogether, because it's not really worth it. So how do you re-engage those professionals? How do you bring them back to a kind of project that motivates them to work? I think that's a big challenge moving forward.
Great. I'd like to thank you all very much for being part of this important panel. We are discussing grand societal challenges within our annual meeting. Of course, we couldn't avoid talking about populism as we're heading toward election in early October. I'm still a strong believer in the Brazilian democracy, and I hope that the democracy will talk louder than populism or authoritarianism that we are facing today. Thank you very much to each of you. The panel will be available on our YouTube channel for other participants that weren't able to join us today. We had a huge participation, more than 100 people here on Zoom, and others joined on YouTube. Thanks a lot, and I hope to see you again in the near future. Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Take care.